A young woman left for her lunch break but never returned to work. Concerned, her co-workers contacted the police, who quickly launched an investigation. What they discovered next resembled the chilling plot of a horror film rather than a true crime. Still, piece by piece, detectives managed to uncover what really happened. Carolyn Byington was born on May 30th, 1993, in Plainsboro, New Jersey. She lived in Plainsboro with her parents and older sister. And from an early age, she aspired to travel the world. After graduating high school, Carolyn enrolled at Lafayette College, where she participated in 2 study abroad programs, allowing her to explore both Japan and Germany. During her time in college, she completed 3 bachelor's degrees in international affairs, sociology, and anthropology. After finishing her studies in 2015, Carolyn began working at a marketing firm near her hometown and chose to rent an apartment in Plainsboro to remain close to her family. Outside of her job, she volunteered with the local youth league and was actively involved in charitable causes. Over the next few years, Carolyn remained dedicated to her job, continued supporting her community, and traveled whenever she could. On June 10, 2019, the 26-year-old decided to head home during her lunch break. She was expected back at the office later that afternoon. But as the hours passed, there was still no trace of her. Her co-workers grew increasingly concerned and attempted to call her, but Carolyn didn't answer. The situation felt completely out of character. Carolyn was known for her reliability. She rarely missed work and almost never left the office during lunch break. As evening approached and there was still no word from her, concern turned into genuine alarm. Eventually, her co-workers contacted the police, asking them to perform a welfare check. Around 6 p.m., officers arrived at her apartment complex and discovered that her front door was unlocked. Upon entering, they were confronted with a horrifying scene. Carolyn was found lying on the floor, and the amount of blood surrounding her made it immediately evident that she was dead. While the medical examiner began assessing her body, investigators started gathering evidence and interviewing potential witnesses. One neighbor told police that he had heard screaming around noon. He also recalled hearing strange sounds coming from Carolyn's apartment shortly afterward, noises that resembled furniture being moved. However, no one had reported seeing any unfamiliar individuals, and the apartment complex lacked security cameras. Inside the apartment, there was little for detectives to work with. It appeared the killer had attempted to clean up the scene using bleach, likely trying to destroy any trace evidence. The odd sounds the neighbor mentioned were most likely the killer trying to cover their track. As police searched for surveillance footage from surrounding buildings and chased down any possible leads, the medical examiner finalized the autopsy report. Carolyn had sustained multiple blunt force injuries to the head, most likely caused by punches. In addition to the blunt force trauma, Carolyn had been stabbed multiple times in the neck with both a pair of scissors and a screwdriver. There were no signs of sexual assault, and nothing appeared to have been stolen from her apartment. However, one detail caught the detectives' attention. The scissors and screwdriver had come from Carolyn's own home. This helped rule out the 2 most common motives, robbery and sexual assault. Instead, it suggested something far more personal. The level of violence used further supported this idea. It appeared that the attacker wasn't just intent on killing, but was driven by intense rage. Investigators began speaking with Carolyn's family and friends, trying to identify anyone who might have had a reason to hurt her. But no one could name a single person with a motive. Everyone described Carolyn as kind, easygoing, and completely non-confrontational. She wasn't seeing anyone at the time, and she had no troubled relationships or ex-partners who might have held a grudge. Detectives then turned their attention to Carolyn's co-workers, and that's when things began to take a more interesting turn. They discovered that on the same day, Carolyn left the office for lunch. Another employee also left around the same time, a 30-year-old man named Kenneth Saul. At first, this detail didn't seem significant, but what raised suspicions was that Kenneth didn't return to the office until much later in the day. According to their manager, Kenneth had called in saying he was dealing with car trouble and needed to stop by a repair shop. However, when the manager followed up, they found out Kenneth had never gone to the place he claimed. Other co-workers had picked up on odd behavior as well. When Kenneth eventually came back to the office, he appeared anxious and had visible scratches on his hands. During a seemingly casual conversation, he even asked whether someone could be arrested based solely on circumstantial evidence. Detectives were intrigued by these details and decided to dig deeper into Kenneth's background. He was an accountant, married, and had recently welcomed a child into his family. Kenneth's daughter had been born just a year earlier. He had no prior criminal history, and on the surface, he didn't seem like someone who fit the profile of a violent offender. However, the number of warning signs made it impossible for detectives to dismiss him. They decided to question him directly. Kenneth repeated the same explanation he had given his manager, that he left during lunch to take his car to a repair shop. But when detectives asked for a receipt or any form of verification, he couldn't produce one. Later on, Kenneth changed his story. He now claimed that he never went to a repair shop. Instead, he said he had fixed the car himself at a nearby park. This shift in his account immediately raised red flags. For detectives, the mere fact that his story changed at all was deeply suspicious. What made things even more questionable was the fact that Kenneth was an accountant, not someone typically skilled in handling complex car repairs on their own, instead of going to a professional mechanic. Still, Kenneth continued to deny any connection to Carolyn's murder, and at that point, police didn't have enough solid evidence to make an arrest. But then, investigators came across something that caught their attention. While reviewing surveillance footage from nearby businesses, they also examined dashcam footage from a police patrol car that had driven through the area shortly after noon. On that footage, Kenneth's car was clearly visible, completely contradicting his story. Carolyn's apartment complex was located in a different town, about 6 miles from the office. Kenneth had claimed he was working on his car in a park near his workplace, but the footage showed him in the vicinity of Carolyn's home. While this still counted as circumstantial evidence, it significantly strengthened the case against him. Another detail that pointed toward Kenneth came from the autopsy. Medical examiners found skin fragments beneath Carolyn's fingernails, evidence that she had scratched her attacker during the violent struggle. And as it turned out, Kenneth had fresh scratches on his hands, injuries he couldn't provide a clear explanation for. The challenge, however, was that the biological material recovered from under Carolyn's fingernails wasn't sufficient to generate a complete DNA profile. Still, investigators collected a DNA sample from Kenneth and sent it to the lab for comparison. The results came back as inconclusive. While the DNA couldn't be definitively matched to him, it also couldn't rule him out. Although it wasn't the smoking gun police had hoped for, it was enough to keep him under close scrutiny. By now, detectives felt confident that Kenneth was responsible. In the weeks that followed, they continued searching for more definitive evidence, but no new developments surfaced. Eventually, they brought the case to the district attorney. After reviewing everything, they concluded that the collection of circumstantial evidence might be strong enough to convince a jury. So, 2 months after Carolyn's murder, police arrested Kenneth and placed him in custody as he awaited trial. That's when the case took a shocking and unexpected turn. As detectives continued piecing together their case, they received a letter from jail written by none other than Kenneth Selmy. What the inmate revealed stunned everyone involved in the investigation. According to the letter, Kenneth had offered him $15,000 to carry out a murder once he was released from jail. The plan was disturbingly specific. The victim had to be a random woman between the ages of 25 and 30, and the murder weapon had to be a screwdriver and a pair of scissors. Kenneth even instructed the inmate to stab the victim in the neck and to clean the scene with bleach afterward. Detectives had no doubt the inmate was telling the truth, because those exact details about Carolyn's murder had never been made public. The victim had to be a random woman between the ages of 25 and 30, and the murder weapon had to be a screwdriver and a pair of scissors. Kenneth even instructed the inmate to stab the victim in the neck and to clean the scene with bleach afterward. Only the killer would have known the precise weapons used and the method of cleaning the scene. 10:10. It became clear that Kenneth's twisted plan was to stage a second identical killing, creating the illusion of a serial killer. Since he would already be in jail when the second attack took place, he likely believed the police would rule him out and redirect their investigation elsewhere. But that wasn't all. Kenneth also proposed a second, even stranger plan to his cellmate. He said the cellmate could either kill the lead detective working on the case or target one of the people police had already interviewed during the investigation into Carolyn's murder. If he chose the latter, Kenneth instructed him to stage the crime scene to make it appear as if the victim had committed the murder themselves and to leave a note on the body confessing to Carolyn's death. The goal was for the police to believe that the murdered person was actually responsible for killing Carolyn, which would lead to the charges against Kenneth being dropped and his release. Regarding the plan to kill the detective, it wasn't entirely clear what Kenneth expected would happen, but it seemed he thought that without the lead investigator, the entire case would collapse. On top of that, Kenneth even gave his cellmate advice on how to avoid being caught after committing the murder, all while completely ignoring the fact that he himself was already behind bars. The whole scheme was so outlandish it sounded like something a child might dream up. But Kenneth was utterly serious. He truly believed this plan would secure his freedom. After uncovering all this, detectives asked the inmate to wear a wire and bring up the topic during conversations with Kenneth. The inmate agreed, and before long, detectives had recorded Kenneth on tape, casually discussing plans to arrange multiple murders. On the very same day, prison staff conducted a search of Kenneth's cell and discovered several handwritten notes confessing to Carolyn's murder. These notes were intended to be planted next to the body of whoever his cellmate was supposed to kill, just as Kenneth had planned. He had written the notes himself, assuming no one would take the time to compare the handwriting. With this, Kenneth not only gave investigators additional evidence linking him to Carolyn's murder, but also accumulated extra charges for conspiracy to commit murder. Still, despite all the disturbing revelations, detectives had no clear motive for why Kenneth had killed Carolyn. Eventually, though, they got their answer, and it was something nobody expected. Kenneth stayed in jail for several years, and in November 2022, 3 years after his arrest, prosecutors decided to offer him a deal. Despite the overwhelming circumstantial evidence, they lacked a definitive DNA match, fingerprints, or any undeniable physical proof, tying him directly to the crime scene, making the upcoming trial a risky endeavor. So, prosecutors decided to offer Kenneth a deal. 1315. In return for a reduced sentence, 1318, he would have to confess to the murder, and Kenneth accepted. He told investigators that he started working at the company back in 2016, 3 years before the murder. That's where he met Carolyn, and over time, he developed romantic feelings for her, even though he was married. However, Carolyn was not interested and made that very clear. Despite this, Kenneth refused to let go. On the surface, he kept his feelings to himself and never acted on them openly. To most people, it seemed like he had moved on. But behind the scenes, his obsession with Carolyn was quietly growing, intensifying day by day, until it escalated into full-blown stalking. At some point, Kenneth secretly took Carolyn's house keys and made a copy, then returned the original without her ever noticing. From that moment on, he began letting himself into her apartment whenever she was away, usually during his lunch breaks. But it didn't stop there. Eventually, he went even further and installed hidden cameras inside her apartment to watch her without her knowledge. Over the following months, Kenneth kept returning to her apartment to check on the cameras, and on June 10th, he went back again during his lunch break. What he didn't realize was that Carolyn had also decided to go home that day, and because he'd left the office early, he had no idea. Kenneth was used to Carolyn spending her lunch breaks at work, so her unexpected arrival completely caught him off guard. According to his confession, he was inside the apartment when he suddenly heard a key turning in the lock. He quickly hid just out of sight behind the front door, and when Carolyn walked in, he realized he had nowhere to escape. Knowing she was about to see him, Kenneth attacked, slamming her to the floor and striking her head multiple times. Then he grabbed a pair of scissors and a screwdriver from Carolyn's belongings and began stabbing her, mostly targeting her neck. After she was dead, he tried to clean up the blood with bleach, but there was simply too much to erase. So, he gathered all the hidden cameras, fled the apartment, and later returned to the office as if nothing had happened. In January 2023, Kenneth was sentenced to 45 years in prison for the murder, plus an additional 10 years for conspiracy to commit murder due to his attempt to pay a fellow inmate to carry out further killings. Before the sentencing, Kenneth made a final statement in court, expressing his apologies to Carolyn's family. He said, "I'm sorry every day for my choices. If there was any way to undo what I've done, I would do it without hesitation. I deeply regret the pain I've caused you all. No words are strong enough to express the horrors I committed or the suffering I brought upon you." He also apologized to his own family, who were in the courtroom. "I'm sorry for who I am, and for hiding it from you all my life. The mask I wore kept you from seeing any warning signs. I can only imagine the shock and pain you felt discovering the truth." Despite this, many people involved in the case doubted the genuineness of Kenneth's remorse. Not only had he savagely murdered Carolyn to keep his secrets safe, but he also tried to hire his cellmate to kill innocent people, all in a desperate bid to avoid facing the consequences of his actions. Kenneth's wife was completely unaware of his secret actions and filed for divorce soon after his arrest. Despite his expressed remorse, Kenneth quickly attempted to appeal his sentence. He claimed that certain evidence had been gathered in violation of his constitutional rights and should have been excluded from the case. However, in late 2024, the court dismissed his appeal, ruling that there were no legal errors in the way the investigation was conducted. As a result, his original sentence remained intact. At this point, it seems almost certain that Kenneth Saul will spend the rest of his life in prison.